Let us first understand the data which we will use to create the pivot table. So here is the data sheet. If we press Control and right arrow key, so the data extends from column A to column U. And if I press the Control and down arrow key, we see that this data is till the row 9995, so around 10,000 rows of data. The data has the order ID, order dates, shipment date, shipment mode, customer ID, customer name. Then we have the segment, the country, city, state, postal code, region, product ID, product category, subcategory, name of the product, sales, quantity, discount, and profit. So we have a large amount of data, and we will be using this data to understand how we can quickly create a pivot table to do the data analysis. Before inserting a pivot table, we have to ensure that the data is in proper format. The first thing to check is that there shouldn't be any empty rows or columns. The second thing to check is that all the columns should have the headers. These headers will appear in the field list in the pivot table. And the third thing to check is that there shouldn't be any totals or subtotals in between. If there are any totals or subtotals in between, then the pivot table will do a double counting and our data analysis will be impacted. Once we ensure that all the three conditions are met, we can work on the pivot table. To insert a pivot table, we can select the entire data range or click anywhere in this table and then click on Insert Pivot Table. When we click on Pivot Table, it asks whether we want to create the pivot table from a data or range or from an external data source. So in this case, we are creating this pivot table from a data range. So I'll click here. Now this screen pops up and it shows the area selected, which is cell A1 to U9995, which means that the entire data set has been selected. It is also asking whether we want to insert the pivot table in a new worksheet or the existing worksheet. So we usually insert a pivot table in a new worksheet when it is a first pivot table. If we have more than one pivot tables, then we can insert those pivot tables in the existing worksheet where we have all the pivot tables. Cancel it now, and then before inserting the pivot table, let us first convert this data into an Excel table. To convert this data into an Excel table, we'll press Ctrl and T. So this selects the entire data range and then click on OK. Now the data has been converted into an Excel table. We can change the formatting of the Excel table. We select any cell on the data table. The table design tab appears at the top, and we have a few designs over here. So we can select this design. So now this data is in a table format. Now we'll insert the pivot table. So we'll click on Insert Pivot Table from Table or Range. So we see that instead of giving the entire range, it is giving the name of the table. So the name of the table is table 2, which is selected. We'll insert the pivot table in a new worksheet and click OK. So once we click on OK, so we have the pivot table report range, which is on the left, and then pivot table fields on the right. In the pivot table fields, we have the column headers, which we had in our data table. If we click outside of the pivot report range in any cell, the pivot field list goes away. So let's click on the pivot report range. So here we have the column headers in the same order as the columns. So we can change the order from A to Z. So to change the order, we can click on the tools over here and then select sort A to Z. Now it is sorted in alphabetical order. So let's see what happens when we select any field. In the pivot field list, we have the option to drag the field from the field list into a column, row, or values. So let's select the sales. and drag it in values. So when we drag the sales in the values, sum of sales appears in the pivot table. So this is not formatted. So we can format this by right clicking on the number, and then here we have format cells. We can select the number, use the thousand separator, remove the decimals and click OK. So now we have the formatted sales, which is more than 2 million. If we select the region and drag it in the rows, we have the sales by regions. So we have four regions: central, east, south, and west. And we also have the sum of sales for each of these regions. If we want the sales by segment, we can click on the segment. So now we have the sum of the sales by the region and by the segment. So there are three segments in the data set: consumer, corporate, and home office. We have the sales for each region and each segment. We can also play with the appearance of the pivot table. So if I want the segments in the columns, I can just drag and put it in the columns. Now we have the regions in the rows and the segment in the columns. We also have the grand totals. So by the regions and by the segments. If we want to remove the grand totals, so we can click on design, and then on the left we have the grand total. So we can select any of the options. So let's say on for rows only. So now the grand total for the segments go away. We can bring it back by clicking on the pivot table, design, and in grand total on for rows and columns. So now we have the grand total for each of the regions and each of the segments. If we want the revenues by the state, we can click on the state, and now we have the revenues for each region, state, and the segment in our data set. So it's just click, plug and play. So whatever data we want, we just have to select that data and move it in the field list. If we don't want the state, we can select the state, and we have a drop down over here. We can select remove field setting. If we want to bring it back, we can click on state and it comes back. We can also drop it outside of the field. So there's a cross sign which means that the field is removed. If we want to change the appearance, let's say we want the revenues by region, by segment, and then we want the revenues for the state also. We can put the state in columns. So we see that we have the revenue by region and by state, but this doesn't look good. So we can quickly move the state below the regions and segment in the columns. Now we have the table as we had before. We can also move the fields up or down. So if we want the state first and region next, we can move it above the region. So now we have the states and the regions. So we'll move back the regions first and then the state because it looks better. There is a lot of flexibility in pivot table on how we want to analyze our data. In the next video, we'll see some more options on how we can quickly analyze data from the pivot table. Thank you.